Welcome back to Tales from My Shed with me, Gary Guess. And before we begin, I would really appreciate it if you could please subscribe to my channel and could you press like on this video. Thank you very much. So come with me today then and we'll go back to 1915 and we'll meet these guys, the Middlesbrough Pals. They were recruited in the Teesside area in exactly the same way as the Accrington Pals or the Bradford Pals were in the Leeds area or over in Manchester and Liverpool. Mainly with the help of W.J. Bruce, the then Mayor of Middlesbrough, along with some of the local industrialists and the local county territorial associations. They were recruited from the towns and villages surrounding Middlesbrough. This photo shows them whilst the battalion was at Gosforth in Newcastle upon Tyne. So say hello then to the men of the 12th Service Battalion, Yorkshire Regiment, Teesside Pioneers. One of these men that joined the Teesside Battalion was George William Spencley. He was born on the 23rd of December 1894 and is the son of Ralph and Emily Spencley, who originally came from Pickering, a small market town in North Yorkshire. George was my grandfather. George was born in North Ormsby, a small area just outside of Middlesbrough, living at 22 Tees Street in North Ormsby. By the time of the outbreak of the war and the initial uncertain trade conditions, there had been a slump in most industries in the UK with a significant increase in unemployment, especially in the building trades, where George was a bricklayer's labourer. And so on the 23rd of October 1915, and with probably a few of his mates seen here outside the Crown Public House in Cargafleet, George enlisted at Marton, joining what was then the Teesside Battalion. Unfortunately, following gassing at Ypres and a further wounding again at Ypres, the second photo of him in uniform shows he was a shadow of his former self. After the outbreak of the war and the dispatch to France of the 160,000 strong British Expeditionary Force, who was soon in action around Mons in Belgium and Le Cateau before then retreating back through France to the River Marne, where finally the German forces were held. It was supposed to have been said at the time that it would be over by Christmas, but was that really the case? Lord Kitchener for certain was sure that this was going to be a long war and that they would need many men. So men began to answer the call and the first 100,000 of his new army was quickly formed and began training to go to France. There seems to be little evidence that the war was actually going to be over by Christmas, and in all probability this was just the men of the BF and their great enthusiasm who thought that this would be the case. Across Britain, men began flooding the recruiting offices with a great sense of patriotism, or maybe it was an excuse for adventure, a way out of the life of toil and hardship that was the reality for most working class men, the majority of whom never actually left the confines of their own town or village. It doesn't really matter anyway. The plain fact was hundreds of thousands of men flocked these recruiting places in the first 6 months of the war, totally overwhelming the bureaucracy which, in normal times, could cater for around 30,000 men enlisting in 1 year. But here was a similar number being recruited at its peak in 1 day across Britain. By the early part of 1915, recruiting numbers had begun to fall off, and was probably due to the surge in employment provided by industries who were gearing up for full war. Jobs were starting to become plentiful and wages were rising. The War Office, having seen the success of Lord Derby's recruiting efforts over in Liverpool and Manchester, sent out requests to mayors of all cities and towns in Great Britain, asking them to raise local battalions for this new army. A series of public meetings were held in the town hall in Middlesbrough, as well as an exceptional open-air meeting which was held at the corner of Newport Road and Borough Road in Middlesbrough, at what was then called Infirmary Corner. Local dignitaries, business owners and council members exhorted local men to join this battalion, although at one point the Yorkshire Regiment depot was seen to be redirecting men to other battalions within the regiment, which prompted Mayor Bruce to contact the War Office and complain about this. And on Monday the 18th of January's edition of the North Star newspaper, an order was sent out saying, following requests to the War Office, details have been settled and Major Rance, the officer in charge of recruiting in the Middlesbrough area, gave an order that all men who volunteered in the Middlesbrough recruiting area should be allocated to this battalion. question now was where to house these recruits locally, and the answer came in the form of Marton Hall. 5 miles from the town of Middlesbrough, the small village of Marton, which was still at that time surrounded by agricultural land. Henry Balcour, the owner, had died in 1878, and initially Carl, his heir, moved into Marton Hall with his family, but he didn't possess the business brain that his uncle had, and when the iron trade slumped in 1880, Carl's fortune was lost. Marton Hall was closed in the year 1892, the year of the first Durham coal strike, and things got so bad apparently that Carl, almost bankrupt at the turn of the century, moved out of the hall and into one of the gate lodges, shooting rabbits apparently off the estate to stay alive. When eventually matters improved, Carl retired to Torquay, where he died in 1915, and Marton Hall, with its 60 rooms, its marble staircases and fine statues, remained empty until Middlesbrough Corporation decided to lease the hall and use it as a training depot. The marble floors and staircases and the balustrades around them were all boxed in with timber. The rooms were emptied and converted into barrack rooms. The stables were also converted to cater for the overflow of those men unable to fit into the main hall. The stable yard was also reported to have been roofed over to provide messing facilities for the other ranks of the battalion. Fortunately, uniforms and leather equipment were produced quite quickly, meaning that the recruits would at least look like soldiers, unlike in some parts of the country where the men were still being given Kitchener blues, so called because of the use of the blue serge that the post office uniforms were made of, and it was hurriedly being used to make uniforms for these new Kitchener battalions. We see on this map, held by Teesside Archives, where the hall and its stable complex was located. A description of the hall from a souvenir booklet used at the opening of Stewart's Park when Marton Hall was gifted to the local area in 1928 says that the hall had a tessellated pavement of white and black marble. The walls were relieved by columns of Carrara marble, while a broad staircase and balcony above was of the same material. A glass roof let in a flood of light upon one of Hansier's greatest paintings, which hung above the first floor landing. The painting now hangs in the Captain Cook Birthplace Museum inside Stewart's Park, and it's built where the hall stood before it was destroyed by fire in the 1960s. All these valuable paintings in their massive frames, the noble busts and every decoration apparently ensured that no expense was spared in producing a princely mansion, and the grounds were frequently thrown open for the delectation of Henry Balcour MP's constituents and in the aid of funds of religious bodies. In 1858, Henry Balcour erected a granite vase to commemorate the site of Captain Cook's birthplace, Corridge. Records also from Teesside Archives show that after Mr Balcour's death on the 18th of June 1878, he bequeathed the hall together with the grounds, furniture and paintings, etc. to his nephew Carl, with a provision that the hall should remain in succession for 4 generations. In order to shoehorn the nearly 1,000 men into the accommodation at Marton Hall, major alterations would have been required, and a company of civil engineers was initially retained to survey the hall. They had to ascertain how many men could be fitted into each of the rooms. Specified by the War Office regulations at the time that 600 cubic feet of space per man was required, but Field Service Regulations sanitary orders in 1913 reduced this to 40 square feet with 400 cubic feet of surrounding space. And as can be seen by these blueprints created by S.E. Burgess, the civil engineering company, they worked out that the main hall could hold 478 men, allowing this prescribed 400 cubic feet of space. The remaining 300 men would be accommodated in the stable blocks north of the hall, which were also duly converted using the same regulations, and it was said at the time that no man was accommodated under canvas throughout his tenure at Marton Hall. Henry Balcour had been one of the principal men responsible for the rise of Middlesbrough, the infant Hercules as it was known, on the River Tees, so named by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, William Gladstone, in 1862. He wrote a letter to the then Mayor describing the town as a remarkable place, the youngest child, as I may call it, of England's enterprise, an infant Hercules. In 1915, an agreement was signed by the owners and the War Department for the duration of the war under the Defence of the Realm Act of 1915. This saw the mansion, its grounds and amenities, being released for the sum of £300 per quarter to be paid yearly, agreeing also that the government department would keep all interior parts of the same premises in as good a condition as they were now, allowing, of course, reasonable wear and tear, destruction or damage by the King's enemies, by fire, storm or tempest, which were exempted, of course. As part of the provision for the recreation of the men now being sent to Marton Hall, the local YMCA donated a wooden hut, which was placed in the grounds to provide entertainment and an area to associate after a day's training. As reported by the local Daily Gazette at the time, this particular hut was a large, very well warmed and very well lighted building, and was intended as a gathering centre for the men where they can, in their leisure moments, enjoy social intercourse, write letters and indulge in games. Refreshments could also be secured at quite normal prices, but no alcohol was served because of the various temperance movements popular at the time and the YMCA's name. So it wasn't out of keeping with its time that only soft refreshments were served. In this photo again from Teesside Archives, these two men look quite healthy and well fed, and as part of the continuing recruitment drive, the local Daily Gazette on the 23rd of March 1915 ran a section which showed what food the men were being fed. It's said to have been prepared by a first-class caterer, so the food would be plain but not lack variety. It was also recorded at the time by Lady Bell in her book At the Works, and it showed that the diet of most working class men of the period was really quite poor. Meat content was low, as were fresh vegetables, and the greater part of the diet consisted mainly of bread. This diet badly affected the growth patterns of working class men, hindering their development and their ability to resist diseases, which is also evidenced throughout the service records that I've collected, and the recruiting medicals show the number of malnourished men was quite high, as was the state of their teeth. In order to withstand the constant presence of hardtack, the bread alternative biscuit being fed to soldiers, teeth of an acceptable standard were a requirement, and there were many instances of dental caries, meaning that dental treatment was quite commonly given. But once the men's diet had improved, and along with the healthy exercise they were getting, it was no surprise that men began to grow rapidly. Some of them grew nearly 2 inches, and they also put on substantial weight and increased muscle mass. And as you can see, these two lads here are fully equipped with their leather pattern accoutrements and the 1907 pattern uniforms, complete with a short magazine Lee-Enfield rifle. They look the epitome of efficient and ready for service soldiers. Even though the men had been medically examined at enlistment, underlying and unforeseen problems still affected some men, sometimes tragically, as in this case of bugler William Charlton. A former schoolmaster and scout leader from Eston, he went to bed one evening feeling unwell, but was discovered the following morning by his comrades to be dead. However, as was reported in the local press, poor William Charlton succumbed to what we would probably call today meningitis, following the investigation and an autopsy report which showed that found in his brain were microorganisms of a positive nature. What germ it was is unknown, but it was something of the kind, and it was a natural cause of death, which, though it caused sadness and little anger to his family, as well as his pupils and Boy Scouts, he was duly buried in Eston Cemetery. Wasting no time after the formation of the battalion, the Mayor sent the following telegram to a Major Becker, Duke of Wellington Regiment at the barracks in Halifax. He said, "Colonel Watson, General Officer Commanding in York, has suggested your name to me as a suitable person to accept appointment of Commanding Officer." Major Becker sent his acceptance the next day, adding in a personal letter to the Mayor on the 26th of December. He hoped they would not expect too much of him, as since having resigned his commission in 1907, he had been out of the army as a reserve for 8 years. In fact, Becker, the third son of Sir Rickson Becker, a third baronet born in Ireland on the 27th of July 1866, had over 20 years of military experience, including service in South Africa between 1900 and 1902, and it proved to be a good appointment. He remained with the battalion until it ceased to exist in 1918, and in a letter to the Iron Duke, regimental magazine of the Duke of Wellington's regiment in 1951, a good friend of his wrote to the editor saying Becker was a great sportsman, a keen polo player, and was very clever with his hands at any job from gardening to building a blockhouse. He came out to the 1st Battalion at Bloemfontein from the regimental depot in May 1900, serving with it until the end of the South African War. He went on to say that I got to know him very well in June, August and September, when I was his subaltern on the trek with B Company in the McGeelysburg range west of Pretoria. At the time they were mostly entirely on their own, and he had unbounded admiration for him. I also enclose a copy of a pencil sketch he went on. I made of him at the time. The beard he grew during the war was very becoming to him, and the last I saw him was in 1918 in London, when he'd just recovered from a severe head wound. On my congratulating him on his lucky escape, Becker replied that his head was far too hard for any Boche to break. Colonel Becker, as he became, retired and settled in Ireland as a farmer before his death in 1951. He was mentioned in dispatches in South Africa for his duties and also received the DSO for his efforts in the First World War. The battalion's second in command was a Major R.B. Turton of Kildale Hall, a barrister at the time. The adjutant was Lieutenant T.K.G. Ridley, who was born in Courtham in 1895. The company commanders were W Company was Captain C.M. Southey, X Company was commanded by Captain Clive Mildred, with Captain E.M. Alexander commanding Y Company, and Z Company was commanded by Major J.J. O'Sullivan. These were all local men. On the 10th of May 1915, the battalion moved from its home at Marton Hall to Gosforth near Newcastle upon Tyne. Nothing much is recorded about the battalion and the time it spent there, but according to Private Frederick Durrans, number 23352, who lived at 39 Allison Street in Gisborough before he enlisted, aged 31, he sent a letter to a friend of his, a Mrs. Kirby at Shortridge Terrace in Jesmond, saying, "Dear friends, just a line to say the reason I haven't paid you another visit is because we're being kept to camp owing to a good case of fires. You may be sure I'll come to see you again as soon as possible, as we're all tired of being fastened up here. Yours sincerely, Fred Durrans." According to the local papers, the battalion football team contains some of the top footballers from Middlesbrough FC, players like Henry Cook and Joe Hisbent, as well as the club secretary Tom McIntosh. They played a couple of the local teams whilst at Gosforth, and a benefit match was played at Ayresome Park. The battalion then moved to Cannock Chase in Staffordshire, now officially designated as a Pioneer Battalion. After the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, existing barracks in the United Kingdom could accommodate around about 175,000 men. But by December of 1914, over 1 million men had enlisted, and accommodation problems were becoming acute. At first, the troops lived in tented camps and requisitioned schools and even factories. Plans had been made to create wooden hutted camps, and these had hastily been erected in various parts of the country. By the late summer of 1915, camps were ready for about 850,000 men, which indicates the frantic pace at which they were being erected. Selection of Cannock Chase as a site for wartime camps must have been influenced by its central position, its proximity to mainline railways, as well as its previous suitability for military training during the South African War. Its lack of interference with agricultural land was also very important. Much of the land around Cannock Chase had been requisitioned during the war, but it seems that in the case of Brockton Camp at least, the land hadn't been given grudgingly, and a letter from Northern Command at York in December 4, 1914 expressed thanks to Lord Litfield for his very kind offer to allow troops to be located on his property on Cannock Chase. Some confusion still exists as to the names and extent of the camps. Brockton Camp, Rugeley Camp, Hanson's Bank Camp, Penkridge Bank Camp and Cannock Chase Camp are all names which are used either officially or unofficially in many contemporary accounts, but there was only really two camps, Rugeley and Brockton. Basically the whole of Cannock Chase camp complex is arranged by the conformation to the ground conditions. Rugeley camp, including the Penkridge Bank portion, is separated from Brockton camp by the Sherbrooke Valley, and the Anson's Bank and Camp Road portions of Brockton camp are separated from the main camp area by Old Acre Valley. By 1917, all of Kitchener's new army divisions and the territorial force divisions had gone overseas, so the camps were increasingly occupied in the main by training and reserve units and Dominion forces, mainly the New Zealanders. We are the Bantam soldiers, the short arse company. We have no height, we cannot fight. What bloody good are we? But when we get to Berlin, the Kaiser, he will say, "Hoch, hoch, mein Gott, what a bloody fine lot is the Bantam Company." The men in the poem went on to become the Bantam formations of the British Army and were formed in 1914. 40th Division was formed in September of 1914, but by 1915 it had begun to feel the effects of the reduction in recruiting numbers. So the height requirements, for instance, were lowered by calls from men such as Alfred Bigland, the so-called King of Lancashire, due to his many business dealings in Lancashire. This allowed short men of good quality to enlist, as reported in the 40th Division history. Although 40th Division was initially designated to be a Bantam Division, and it was staffed with men between the height of 4'10" and 5'3", unfortunately, recruitment at these low standards also meant that the general physique of many of these men wasn't equal to the stress of military service. And by 1915, the division and brigade commanders had realised there would have to be a drastic weeding out of the ranks once the division was completely assembled. So staff officers were dispatched to Lancashire, Edinburgh and Glasgow in an effort to speed up recruiting. Several of the units were already under strength and contained such a large proportion of these men that one infantry battalion went from around 1,000 strong down to about 200 by medical rejections. Because of this, the division wouldn't be fit for service until the problem was solved. This held them back from their deployment until the summer of 1916, which possibly saved them from the battles of the Somme that were planned for later that year. Eventually, 4 battalions were reassigned by the War Office to 40th Division, resulting in 2 battalions of the Middlesex Regiment, 1 of the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, and 1 from the Highland Light Infantry being posted into the division. The division was now made of Scottish, Welsh and English units. Unfortunately, this meant that they lost their Bantam identity. 40th Division now had 3 infantry brigades, 119th, 120th and 121st, plus its Royal Engineer Field Companies, and as part of these divisional troops, the 12th Battalion Yorkshire Regiment Teesside Pioneers joined the division in August of 1915. The Teesside Pioneers could and indeed would be called on as infantry, as well as their designated engineering tasks, joined by field ambulances, ammunition supply train as well as an artillery contingent. This meant that 119th Brigade was to be all Welsh. 120th Brigade was really an Anglo-Scottish brigade, but it still became known as the 120th Scottish Brigade. 121st Brigade, though, was entirely English, and the division was now complete and ready for deployment. On the 27th of May 1916, the division, including the Teesside Pioneers, was fully ready for overseas service, and one of the final parades was inspected by His Majesty the King. It was reported in that day's North Eastern Daily Gazette that the Mayor of Middlesbrough, Alderman W.J. Bruce, and his wife were presented to His Majesty, who congratulated him on recruiting such a fine body of men. Now that the division was ready, all they were waiting for now was their deployment orders and a move over to France. And we'll follow the Teesside Pioneers, the Middlesbrough Pals, and we'll look at their exploits whilst they were over in France. So from me, Gary Guess, thanks for watching another Tales from my shed, and we'll see you next time.